Growing up, our family portrait, like so many others, was carefully curated for public consumption. From the outside, we appeared to be the quintessential normal family. Mom, always in the kitchen, a whirlwind of domestic energy, her smile a seemingly permanent fixture, radiating warmth and care. Dad, quieter, a man of few words, but his presence was a steady, comforting anchor in our lives. And Mark, my older brother, the classic sibling blend of annoying teasing and occasional, begrudging protectiveness. We had our predictable routines: Sunday dinners, annual holidays, the comfortable, often unspoken language of shared history. We navigated the usual family squabbles, developed our own arsenal of inside jokes, and settled into the familiar rhythm of our unique family dynamic. But looking back now, with the clarity of hindsight sharpened by pain, I see the subtle imperfections beneath the glossy surface, the hairline fractures that eventually widened into gaping chasms. There were always hushed conversations behind closed doors, a certain tension in the air during discussions about finances, and a subtle undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name at the time, a feeling that things weren't always as idyllic as they appeared in our carefully posed family photos. The shift began subtly, almost imperceptibly, a creeping unease that initially manifested in vague physical complaints. It started with a persistent feeling of being unwell, a low-grade nausea that seemed to cling to me relentlessly, like a persistent shadow. Then came the dizzy spells, sudden attacks that would send the room tilting and swaying without any discernible trigger, leaving me disoriented and weak. And underlying it all was a bone-deep fatigue, a weariness that no amount of sleep could alleviate, leaving me feeling perpetually drained and listless. I consulted doctor after doctor, each appointment a cycle of sterile environments, probing questions, and, ultimately, the frustratingly familiar reassurance of normal test results. Stress, they'd suggest, their brows furrowed in professional concern. Perhaps a lingering virus that's taking its time to run its course. But I knew, with a certainty that grew stronger with each passing day, that it was more than just stress or a common illness. This wasn't a passing bug. This was something constant, something insidious slowly taking root and spreading within me. My body felt like it was betraying me from the inside out, and the lack of a clear diagnosis only amplified my growing anxiety. The first truly chilling thought, the one that sent a shiver of ice down my spine, flickered into my consciousness one evening over Mom's famous lasagna. It was a dish that had always been a source of comfort, a culinary symbol of home. But after just a few bites, that now familiar wave of sickness washed over me, this time more intense than ever before. As I looked up at my family, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of what seemed like concern, a terrifying seed of suspicion began to sprout in the fertile ground of my growing unease. Could they? The thought was so outlandish, so utterly preposterous, that my mind recoiled from it. My family? The people who had nurtured me, who had held my hand through childhood illnesses, who had always been there, they would never intentionally inflict harm upon me. But the thought, once planted, stubbornly refused to wither. It took root and grew, nourished by each dizzy spell, each wave of debilitating nausea. I started observing everything with a heightened, almost paranoid awareness. Who was in the kitchen when my meals were being prepared? What exactly did I consume throughout the day? I began to notice subtle patterns, small details that had previously escaped my notice. My symptoms seemed to intensify after eating meals at home, particularly after dishes that Mom had lovingly prepared. And Mark, always the first to offer a refill, seemed a little too eager, his eyes perhaps holding a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher as he topped up my water glass or offered me another cup of tea. Dad, usually the most observant and attuned to the nuances of our family, appeared strangely preoccupied, almost deliberately oblivious to my increasingly fragile state of health, his gaze often drifting towards the television or the newspaper during my most obvious bouts of discomfort. Driven by a gnawing fear that was rapidly solidifying into a terrifying conviction, I decided to take matters into my own hands. A small, unassuming notebook, usually reserved for grocery lists and random thoughts, became my clandestine confidant. Its pages filled with meticulous entries, detailing every single thing I ate and drank, the precise time and nature of my symptoms, and even my subjective assessment of their severity. I also began to discreetly collect tiny samples of my food and drinks whenever I felt particularly unwell, using small, airtight containers that I hid in the back of my closet, carefully labeled with the date and time. It felt like something straight out of a spy movie, a bizarre and unsettling game of cat and mouse within my own home, and the sheer absurdity of it only underscored the terrifying reality I was slowly beginning to confront. Weeks bled into a tense dance of feigned normalcy and underlying suspicion. Then, one evening, after a particularly debilitating dinner that left me feeling as though I had been run over by a truck, I collapsed onto the sofa in the living room, the familiar world around me tilting and swaying precariously. Later that night, propelled by a cold dread that had settled deep in my bones, I crept downstairs. The house was cloaked in an unnerving silence, the only sound the gentle, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator emanating from the kitchen. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the stillness as I navigated the darkened rooms. I started my search in the kitchen, the heart of our home, carefully sifting through the contents of the trash can. And then, tucked beneath a wilting pile of vegetable peelings and discarded packaging, I saw it. A small, almost empty bottle, its plastic slightly crinkled. The label was mostly torn away, a deliberate act, I realized with a jolt. But my breath hitched in my throat as my eyes focused on the remaining fragments of text. Antimony potassium tartrate. The name resonated with a chilling, almost sinister familiarity. It was a poison, something I vaguely remembered encountering in the pages of an old Agatha Christie novel, a substance often used in classic tales of intrigue and murder. My hands trembled as I frantically searched online, typing the unfamiliar chemical name into my laptop. Antimony poisoning symptoms. The search results that flooded my screen were like a punch to the gut, each line confirming my worst fears. Nausea, persistent vomiting, debilitating dizziness, overwhelming fatigue. A perfect, horrifying match for every single symptom I had been experiencing for months. The articles warned that while antimony poisoning wasn't typically lethal in small, repeated doses, prolonged exposure could lead to severe and lasting health issues, even organ damage and eventual death. Where, in this day and age, would my seemingly ordinary family have gotten their hands on such a toxic substance? And the question that clawed at my insides, the one that kept me awake at night, was the most agonizing of all. Why? What possible motive could they have? The answer, when it finally came, was even more sickening and twisted than anything my worst nightmares could have conjured. I had started acting a little better in their presence, feigning moments of increased energy and well-being, hoping to lull them into a false sense of security, to make them believe their insidious plan was progressing smoothly. One seemingly ordinary sunny afternoon, I strategically placed my phone on the living room coffee table, discreetly activated the voice recording app, and then went upstairs, pretending to succumb to another wave of exhaustion. What I inadvertently overheard from the floor above still makes my stomach churn with a potent mix of disgust and disbelief. "She's been complaining about those dizzy spells again," Mom said, her voice carrying a disturbingly cheerful tone, almost as if she were discussing the weather. "Yeah, just like Dr. Evans said," Mark replied, a smugness in his voice that I had never truly registered before, a subtle undercurrent of satisfaction that now sent a shiver down my spine. "A few more weeks of this, and she'll definitely qualify for the long-term care benefit. We just need to keep it going. We just need to make sure the symptoms don't disappear completely," Dad added, his usual quiet tone replaced with an unnerving firmness, a cold calculation that revealed a side of him I had never witnessed. "A little bit in her tea every day, maybe a bit more in her soup. Just enough to keep her feeling consistently sick, but not enough to raise any real alarms with the doctors." They were talking about my health insurance. My policy through work was excellent, a safety net I had always been grateful for, particularly the substantial long-term care provision. They weren't trying to kill me outright, not in the dramatic, instantaneous sense. Their plan was far more insidious, far more cruel. They were trying to make me chronically ill, to render me incapable of caring for myself, to trigger a massive payout from my insurance company that they, presumably, would then control. They were systematically poisoning me, day after day, for cold, hard cash. My own flesh and blood. The people who had raised me, who had taught me right from wrong, were deliberately and callously making me sick for their own selfish financial gain. The betrayal was so profound, so utterly devastating, that for a long moment, I felt nothing but a cold, empty void where my heart used to be. But that emptiness soon began to fill, slowly at first, then with an unstoppable force, with a white-hot, all-consuming rage. How dare they? How could they look me in the eye, share meals with me, offer me seemingly loving gestures, all while secretly poisoning me, slowly eroding my health and my life? In that moment, the last vestiges of familial loyalty shattered. I knew, with unwavering certainty, that I couldn't simply walk away from this. They had deliberately tried to harm me, to profit from my suffering. They needed to pay, and they needed to pay dearly. And I, the daughter they had so carelessly plotted against, was going to make absolutely sure they did, in a way they would never, ever forget. My immediate focus shifted from fear and confusion to a steely resolve. My priority was to solidify my evidence, to build an airtight case against them. I continued my clandestine collection of food and drink samples, meticulously labeling each one with the precise date and time of collection. My phone became an indispensable tool, an extension of my hand, constantly recording seemingly innocuous conversations, capturing any further slip-ups or incriminating remarks they might make. I even managed to retrieve the bottle containing the antimony from the trash for a second time, this time handling it with extreme care, using gloves to avoid leaving my own fingerprints and placing it securely in a clean, sealed evidence bag to preserve any potential forensic evidence. I knew that a direct confrontation would be foolish and potentially dangerous. They would undoubtedly deny everything, resorting to gaslighting and manipulation, and would likely become even more cautious, perhaps even escalating their actions to ensure their plan succeeded. I needed a meticulously crafted plan, a way to expose their monstrous scheme and ensure they faced the full weight of the law, all while protecting myself from further harm. I confided in a trusted friend, someone outside of my immediate family who had always been a source of unwavering support. They listened with shock and disbelief, offering their unwavering support and helping me connect with a lawyer. Miss Davies was a formidable woman. Her reputation for being sharp, intelligent, and utterly relentless in the pursuit of justice preceded her. I laid out my entire story, presenting her with the growing mountain of evidence I had painstakingly compiled. She listened intently, her expression shifting from initial disbelief to a grim determination as she reviewed the recordings and examined the physical evidence. She immediately took my case, her professional demeanor radiating confidence and assuring me that we would see this through to the end. Her first crucial piece of advice was to undergo a comprehensive medical examination, including specific and detailed toxicology tests, performed by a doctor she trusted implicitly, someone who would be discreet and thorough. The results of the toxicology tests arrived a few agonizing days later, the stark black and white of the official report confirming my darkest and most terrifying fears. Traces of antimony were indeed present in my system. The levels, while not immediately life-threatening, were undeniably there and, disturbingly, had been steadily increasing over the past few weeks, mirroring the timeline of my worsening symptoms. Miss Davies reviewed the report with a grave expression, assuring me that this, combined with the audio recordings and the physical evidence of the poison itself, constituted a compelling and legally sound case against my family. Now, the stage was finally set. It was time for my carefully planned performance, the moment to turn the tables on those who had so callously plotted against me. I knew I had to be patient, to time everything with absolute precision. I decided to lull them into an even deeper sense of security, to make them believe their twisted plan was on the verge of its successful and profitable conclusion. One seemingly ordinary evening, during our usual family dinner, I decided to put on the most convincing act of my life. I took a few bites of my food, making sure to subtly grimace and clutch my stomach. Then, with a well-timed gasp, I feigned a sudden and severe dizzy spell, my eyes rolling back in my head as I slumped forward, pretending to lose consciousness and dramatically fall onto the floor. My family sprang into action, their reactions a grotesque tableau of feigned panic and barely concealed anticipation. "Oh my God, Maya!" Mom shrieked, her voice laced with a theatrical hysteria that even I could recognize as forced. "Mark, call an ambulance." "No. She's getting worse." Mark fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking slightly, but I caught a fleeting glimpse of a nervous, almost triumphant smile flickering across his lips before he quickly masked it with an exaggerated expression of worry. Dad simply stood there, his face strangely devoid of genuine emotion, almost as if a heavy burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. I played the part of the semi-conscious victim with Oscar-worthy dedication as the paramedics arrived, their hurried movements and genuinely concerned questions a stark contrast to my family's overacted and slightly unconvincing performance. They checked my vitals, their brows furrowed with professional concern, and based on my convincingly feigned symptoms and my family's frantic, albeit slightly too enthusiastic, explanations, they made the decision to transport me to the nearest hospital for further evaluation. Lying in the sterile, brightly lit hospital bed, I continued the charade, feigning bouts of severe nausea and dizziness whenever a nurse or doctor came to check on me. My family hovered around my bedside, their expressions a carefully rehearsed display of concern and solicitude for the benefit of the medical staff. They brought wilting flowers, offered hollow and insincere words of comfort, their eyes occasionally meeting with a shared, almost conspiratorial gleam that betrayed their true intentions, the anticipation of the impending insurance payout that they believed was now within their grasp. That night, while my family was presumably at home, congratulating themselves on their near success and perhaps even discussing how they would spend their ill-gotten gains, I quietly slipped out of the hospital. Miss Davies had orchestrated everything with meticulous precision and the assistance of the authorities. We had already provided the police with all the damning evidence we had collected. They were now simply waiting for my family to make their next and final move, to file that fraudulent insurance claim that would seal their fate. The next morning, my family arrived at the hospital, their faces radiating a sickening blend of false concern and barely concealed avarice. They undoubtedly expected to find me still weak, vulnerable, and ready to be discharged into their loving care. Instead, they were met by a team of uniformed police officers, their expressions serious and unwavering. The officers calmly informed them that they were all under arrest, not for a minor infraction, but for the serious felonies of attempted aggravated assault and insurance fraud. The looks on their faces were a truly unforgettable spectacle, a perfect snapshot of utter shock and disbelief. Mom's carefully constructed facade of maternal concern crumbled completely, her jaw dropping in genuine astonishment, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. Dad's face, usually so impassive and controlled, turned ashen gray, his eyes darting around the room in panicked confusion. And Mark's ever-present smirk, that habitual expression of smug superiority, finally and completely vanished, replaced by a raw, unadulterated panic that was almost comical in its intensity. They sputtered denials, their voices rising in panicked protest, vehemently proclaiming their innocence, but the police remained unmoved, their grip firm as they read them their rights. They had the evidence, the undeniable proof of their guilt, the bottle containing the antimony, the toxicology reports confirming its presence in my system, and most damningly, the audio recordings capturing their cold and calculated conversations. The news of their arrests spread through our small community like wildfire, igniting a frenzy of shock, disbelief, and outrage. Extended family members, lifelong friends, and casual acquaintances, everyone was stunned, horrified by the public revelation of their monstrous scheme. My parents and brother, once seemingly respectable pillars of our little town, were now plastered across local news channels and social media feeds, their faces etched with shame and disbelief as the details of their betrayal were laid bare for all to see. The insurance company, upon learning the full extent of the attempted fraud, was understandably incensed and immediately launched its own thorough and aggressive investigation, undoubtedly adding another layer of legal and financial woes to my family's already considerable troubles. The legal process that followed was lengthy, complex, and emotionally draining, dragging on for what felt like an eternity. But in the end, justice, however delayed, finally prevailed. The evidence against them was overwhelming, a damning indictment of their greed and their callous disregard for my well-being. They were all found guilty on multiple charges and sentenced to significant terms in state prison. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as the judge delivered the final verdict, the weight of their profound betrayal and the irreversible consequences of their despicable actions hanging heavy in the air. Watching my own family being led away in handcuffs, their faces etched with a mixture of anger and despair, was a surreal and deeply unsettling experience, a moment that will forever be seared into my memory. There were moments in the quiet solitude of my apartment in the weeks that followed, when I wrestled with doubt, when the weight of what I had done felt almost unbearable. I questioned if I had been too harsh, if there was any other way I could have handled the situation. But then, the vivid memories would flood back, unbidden and sharp, the constant, debilitating nausea, the terrifying dizzy spells, the chilling realization of their cold-blooded betrayal. They had deliberately and systematically tried to harm me, to profit from my suffering. They had made their choices, and they deserved to face the full weight of the law. In the immediate aftermath, I knew I couldn't remain in that town, surrounded by the painful ghosts of what my family had once been, haunted by the memories of their deception. I packed my belongings, said a quiet goodbye to the few genuine friends who had stood by me throughout the ordeal, and made the difficult decision to move to a new city, a place where no one knew my name or the dark story that had become my reality. I found a new job, a small, anonymous apartment, and slowly, painstakingly, began the arduous process of emotional and psychological healing. I surrounded myself with people who were kind, trustworthy, and genuinely cared about my well-being, people who offered support without judgment. Rebuilding trust was a long and challenging journey, filled with moments of doubt and vulnerability, but with each passing day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like the person I used to be, before the insidious poison had begun to cloud my days. This entire ordeal was a nightmare, a dark and twisted chapter of my life that I desperately wish I could simply erase from my memory. But in a strange, almost paradoxical way, it also forged me into someone stronger, more resilient than I ever thought possible. I learned that the simple act of sharing blood doesn't automatically equate to genuine love or unwavering loyalty. I learned that sometimes, the people who are supposed to be your closest confidants, your most steadfast protectors, are the very ones capable of inflicting the deepest and most lasting wounds. And most importantly, I learned the invaluable lesson of self-preservation, the absolute necessity of trusting my own instincts and fighting fiercely for my own well-being, even when it means making the incredibly difficult and painful choice to turn against those you once held most dear.